Oi, Quito. Killer reminds me a lot of Bertolt in that scene. He's like, Reina, we're doing this? For real? I think Kid deserves some recognition after this. I truly think he does deserve some rec because no matter how hard and how often life pushes his head inside of a toilet, he always gets back up again and he doesn't get discouraged. It's no wonder he's one of the chosen few to have Conqueror's hockey. The new information we get makes it seem as if it was Ben, the one who took his arm off. And if that's the case, I have some takes about that. I have some things that I want to say about that a little bit later. This week we get a color spread that looks like it could be part of a scrapbook. Got Robin and Nami looking like Instagram models, Nami hugging Chopper as if he were some kind of plushie, and then Sanji wearing a shirt with the very famous popular saying of kill two birds with one piece. We get sort of a callback to a scene in Punk Hazard where Robin warns Luffy that pirate alliances typically end in betrayal, after which Luffy turns to Law and asks, hey, are you going to betray me? And Law says no. And then Luffy says, then it's all good. So in this case, the gag of Luffy being overly trusting is actually playing off of Kaku. We find out that S-Hawk has the powers of the Dice fruit, or the Supa Supa no Mi, which was definitely one of the powers that I remember considering as a possibility. I think it was between S-Hawk having Mr. One's double fruit or Buggy's double fruit. If I'm being honest, I do think that S-Hawk having the Bara Bara no Mi would have made for a much more interesting fight, just because Zoro has already beaten Mr. One. So if he had Buggy's fruit, it would have presented a cool challenge for Zoro, right? Like, how do you cut something that's theoretically uncuttable? But then again, given that we know that Buggy was a Shichibukai, it's only fair and fitting that the Buggy Seraphim is the one that ends up getting Buggy's double fruit power. Now, I don't know if anybody else picked up on this or if it was just me, but in the scenes where we get Kaku telling Lucci not to be so blunt about his intentions, the way that Kaku was acting reminded me a lot of Usopp. And so we get to see Lucci sort of begin the process of beginning to warm up to Luffy so that he can eventually, somewhere down the line, end up acknowledging Luffy as a true Yonko. Quick fun fact about Lucci, a fan brought this up in an SBS a long time ago about how if you take Lucci's name, Rob Lucci, rob meaning like to rob, to steal, and then the word Lucci meaning light in Italian, it's almost as if his name were to mean somebody who steals the light away or somebody who extinguishes the light, which is of course something that we've heard the Gorosei bring up when speaking to Imu. Now, despite Oda constantly force-feeding Luffy to the reader as this figure of salvation for the One Piece world and this character that everybody should end up liking, I do have to admit that I think it's a smart move how Luffy takes Lucci's killer instinct and uses it in his favor. And he does this by telling him, hey, it's me you want dead, right? It's me you want to fight. So after this is said and done, don't go for anybody else but me. Now, I don't know if the Urususu Shock Blast was able to hit any of the people there, but we do know that both Luffy and Zoro ended up taking that attack back in Thriller Bark, and so it wouldn't be that big of a deal for them. Luffy goes gear fourth, and before he connects the Kong gun on the S-Bear, and before Lucci comes in with the Rokyogan, I thought it was a nice detail how Luffy thinks about Bonnie's attachment to Kuma, to the point where he actually ends up saying her name out loud to show that he remembers it. So the fact that Luffy doesn't use a nickname for Bonnie is important here, because he typically only goes through the work of remembering people's names if they actually mean something to him. Then we get the Rankyaku and Rengoku Onigiri team up between Zoro and Kaku, which reminds me a lot of the team up attack that we saw back in the rooftop in Wano between Zoro and Killer. Now, initially, Zoro had mentioned that he heard Nami scream, and he made the assumption that it was probably one of the Seraphims attacking her. And if there's only 4 Seraphims in total in Egghead, then that must have mean that it was probably S-Shark, because we already saw that S-Snake was dealing with Usopp's group. I mean, that's the assumption, right? But then we also know that Nami was last seen with Edison, and according to a lot of fans, Edison is currently the #1 suspect in terms of who the traitor is. So maybe it was Edison the one who caused Nami's scream by luring her into a trap for her wanting to take the diamonds. And then another thing a lot of you have pointed out is, where is Hattori in all of this? Where is Rob Lucci's pigeon? I feel like because he's gone, Oda's probably going to use him for something important, so you never know. Maybe it's Detective Hattori who ends up solving the mystery of Egghead. Maybe he's the one who ends up finding the ZP0 agents that have gone missing, that are currently locked inside of a giant cylindrical container. We see that Vegapunk has been beaten on the head by someone. And so if those are sea stone handcuffs, then does that mean that he can't use the power of the brain fruit? And also, how much would that matter at this point? Because we know that Vegapunk was already a genius before he ate the power of the brain fruit. It's just that the fruit allows him to have an infinite amount of storage for knowledge. And so the dialogue in that scene makes it obvious that there was already a snitch and a rat within Egghead even before the arc started, which would support the idea that the main culprit here is not Caribou, and it's also not Saturn. I mean, they could both be working with the traitor currently, but they're not the main traitor. So it has to be a Vegapunk satellite, by the looks of it. Apparently somebody also leaked the fact that poneglyph research was being conducted in Egghead. It's kind of a vague statement to keep the reader hooked, because I'm thinking, like, what kind of research? Is it about how the poneglyphs were made and how they're supposedly these indestructible stones? Because we do know that, they're using pyrobloin in Egghead to create the Skypea-like clouds, right? And so pyrobloin comes from volcanoes. And we have that panel of the Kozuki clan crafting the poneglyphs with some volcanoes in the background. So it has to be research about what the poneglyphs say, where they are, or what they're made out of, their chemical composition. So hopefully Robin gets to talk with the Stella, with the main Vegapunk, about this research. There are 100 Marine ships headed directly towards Egghead right now. And we get a new Marine base mentioned here. It's branch G9, which I'm assuming has to be somewhere in the New World. And what's interesting about that is that there's, of course, a filler arc that takes place in Marine base G8. And so in the anime, that takes place after Skypea. But then we also know that Marine base G5 is located in the New World. So pragmatically, regardless of the G8 filler being in the first half of the Grand Line, it makes more sense for G9 to be in the New World. Unless, of course, now the Marines have some sort of way of teleporting a fleet of ships across the Red Line to get to Egghead faster. All of a sudden, we cut to a bar on the port of a far-off country. My first reaction to that establishing shot was, wow, it's good to see that Beppo got promoted, because now he has a ship of his own. And now that the promotion for Film Red has ended, Shanks seems to be more relaxed. Now, in addition to the Red Force, which is Shanks' ship having that Nordic/Viking aspect to its design, something that's interesting about it is also that it has the symbol of the sun on the front as well. So of course we know that the giants worship the sun. And Shanks being here to begin with, I think automatically increases the probability of the final and fourth road poneglyph actually being somewhere in Elbaf. So maybe the truth has always been that in order to get to Laugh-Tale, you have to get through Shanks first. And I'm saying this because from a story standpoint, you have to give Blackbeard a reason to fight Shanks. Now for argument's sake, let's say that the fourth road poneglyph is not in Elbaf. The island still has something very special in it. If you look at the background, you see these very faint, semi-invisible vertical lines, which I've spoken about in a past video about how, given that we see the exact same pattern at the bottom of Sunlight Tree Eve, I think those lines that we see in Elbaf correspond to Treasure Tree Adam. Because back in Water 7, Frankie says that Treasure Tree Adam is said to be in a place where there used to be a bunch of war. And so, of course, we got the warriors of Elbaf, plus we also have the description box in this chapter that states that this region that Kid is in is also known as Warland. Which means that Shanks and the Giants have either been protecting Treasure Tree Adam or the final road poneglyph, or both. And as I mentioned before, in Fishman Island, Usopp is actually the one who makes the potential connection between Treasure Tree Adam and Sunlight Tree Eve, to the point where that panel of him making the observation was completely removed from the anime. Because I guess maybe some of the people in charge thought that it was too much of a spoiler or too much of a hint to have Usopp make this comment, which connects both trees, given that we know that one of Usopp's most important goals is to get to Elbaf. This also takes it back to when he was little, where he would climb up trees and start yelling like, "Pirates are coming, pirates are coming." So there might be a moment in the future where Usopp climbs up the Adam tree and then starts warning everybody about the approaching Blackbeard pirates. Now, in that same panel where we see the tree and we also see the Victoria Punk approaching the island, a little bit further in front of it, there's a ship that has a hummingbird as a figurehead. So I'm wondering if that ship or the people aboard it have anything to do with Brook, because in the past, Brook was known as Humming Brook. There's very little info that we have about Brook pre-Rumber Pirates. All we know is that he used to be the leader of an assault convoy of a certain kingdom. And the fact that we have Rockstar informing Shanks that Kid is attacking the ships takes me back to Fishman Island as well, back when Kid was busy sinking some of Big Mom's ships. And it also takes me back because that's where we learned that it's typical for people to pay tribute to a Yonko in exchange for protection. But in this case, it's Shanks, so he's like, don't worry about it.
We don't do that here.
And last time we saw the Red Hair Pirates, they did mention that they were going to do something about Bartolomeo. So I was thinking, like, did that already happen? Did they already straighten him out? Or is that where they were headed to next? There's a young giant kid at the bar acting just like Luffy used to act. And this is a pretty good time to remember that one of the things that inspired Oda to create One Piece in the first place was a TV series called Vicky the Viking. It's the story about a young Viking boy who wasn't really strong, but he was really smart and witty. So he would use his intelligence and wit to help his fellow Viking. By the way, it looks like the bartender that's with the kid is wearing an apron that says war. Now, the fact that it's a kid with Luffy's dialogue also brings up the theme of inherited will, and it might add something to the speculation about how the Joy Boy of the past could have been a giant. And so Kid is now up against, or is about to face, the strongest crew in the One Piece world, or at least the strongest Yonko crew in the One Piece world. At least up until now in the story, until Luffy surpasses him with his own crew and the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. Or maybe even the members of Cross Guild end up doing something that's incredibly impressive. Maybe they grow in numbers and they do something crazy. But up until now, Shanks has the strongest Yonko crew. And this is a fact. It's not just me making this up, and I will point you to evidence for this. So number one, as we find out in this chapter, Shanks is allied with the Giants. He seems to be an overseer of Elbaf, and Elbaf has been described as the strongest country in the world. Number two is that Dory and Broggy are capable of performing Hakoku sovereignty, which predates Kaido and Big Mom's Hakai, or conquest of the sea. And at the time when the two Yonko used this attack, it was arguably considered to be the strongest attack in the series. Interestingly enough, the people in charge of the anime actually went back to episode 77 to add some auras to Dory and Broggy's attack to display their use of hockey in that scene. By the way, Dory and Broggy's weapons broke after they performed that attack back in Little Garden, but we did get to see them continue their duel in a post-time skip cover page with their bare fists. But now in Elbaf we see that they've gotten themselves new weapons, and apparently they've decided to either finish or put their duel on pause. We also knew that Kashi and Oimo were gonna go back to Elbaf, because that's what they said back in Water 7, so them reuniting with their bosses here just checks off that plot point. Anyway, in addition, the biggest tell as to why Shanks has the strongest crew comes from chapter 957, because in it, as Brand New is talking about the Red Hair Pirates, he says that the crew has the best power balance of any other group. Another way of saying the same thing is that the gap in power between its members is not as big as it is in other Yonko crews. So for example, Ben is actually closer to Shanks in power than, let's say, Katakuri is to Big Mom, or that King is to Kaido. So on average, the power gap between each of the members of the Red Hair Pirates is a lot smaller than it is in other Yonko crews, and each of the members individually has a high enough bounty to go along with that reality. This is why Ben can manage to keep an admiral to stay put temporarily without actually attacking them. This also consequently means that Kid was not joking around during the 2-year time skip, because if Kid didn't get jumped, and if it was actually Ben Beckman who he lost an arm to, then I think that's noteworthy, especially if you consider that Kid lost his arm during the 2-year time skip, and the way that Oda handled Law after the time skip in Dressrosa to make Luffy look good was to have Law lose an arm against Doflamingo. Then again, we also know that there's a huge power jump between Dressrosa Law and Wano Law. It's kind of crazy how much Law grew in power since then. Kind of makes no sense. Another thing that I know some of you have already noted is that because Kid and Killer didn't actually have a face-to-face encounter with Shanks, which, by the way, Kid never claimed that it was Shanks who took his arm off. He just said that he lost it in a fight against the Red Hair Pirates. But because him and Killer didn't actually face Shanks as it stands, it does bring into question Killer's statement about how Kaido is supposedly the world's strongest pirate. Because unless he's just quoting what other people have said about Kaido, how can Killer actually be sure that Kaido is the strongest pirate if him and Kid never actually got to face off against Shanks? I actually have chapter 957 right here, and again, I just kind of want to reread what Brand New says. He says, Beckman, Rue, Yasop, his crewmates are widely renowned, with a high average bounty and the best balance of any pirate crew. No soft targets here. Now, Shanks having the strongest crew doesn't necessarily mean that he is the strongest Yonko, right? So him having the strongest crew and him being the strongest Yonko are two completely different things, right? Two completely different statements. But what this really gets into is the similarities between Luffy's and Shanks's personalities.
and values as well. You got this whole speech in Arlong Park where Luffy tells Arlong, "You're right, like, I don't know how to navigate. I don't know anything about swords. I can't cook. I can't even lie. I always knew that I was going to need friends in life if I was going to get anywhere." And then you got that whole scene in Jaya, in Mocktown, where Luffy tells Zoro not to fight back, even though they're being mocked, which again was inspired by Shanks' behavior, which is very different to the way Kid lives his life, because in Sabaody he says, "I've slaughtered people who have laughed at us." And then Killer was also known in the past for beating people half to death for laughing at him. So ideologically, Kid and Shanks are pretty different. That being said, when it comes to Kid versus Shanks, I feel like I do have a sort of an unpopular opinion about what's going to happen, and that is the fact that the fight will be diffused. There are a lot of narrative factors in play for this fight to be either short-lived, off-screened, or for it to not even happen at all. We know that Oda, the way that he has handled Shanks in the past, is that he uses him sparingly throughout the series to build up hype, and then once the hype gets going, he just, moves to another place. He cuts away from Shanks, and then when he cuts back to Shanks, Shanks is like busy doing something else already. Or he's hyping something else up. Also, Oda has this tendency of not showing too much of Shanks, of not giving too much away when it comes to Shanks' character and his power and his abilities. And that's actually been sort of gradually changing a little bit, in part due to the film Red promotion that he needed to do. But overall, I would be really surprised if we get a full-on fight. Like a full 1v1 fight between Kid and Shanks at this point in the story, it would blow my mind, in terms of how unexpected that would be. Because I do ultimately think that Oda is saving Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates for two things, and that is the reunion with Luffy and the fight against the Blackbeard Pirates. There are also two pieces of dialogue in the chapter from Shanks that, again, gets me to think that Kid versus Shanks is just not going to happen. The first one is when Shanks says, "I can't tell if Kid's timing is the best or the worst." And then most importantly, there's that panel where he says, "I don't want to see major harm come to this place. Will you help me with that, Dory and Broggy?" So what that means is that Shanks needs the help of the giants in order for Elbaf not to suffer major collateral damage. Now, from what I can tell, none of the giants have actually seen that it's Kid, the one approaching the island. And so once they become aware that it's Kid, I'm really interested in seeing what the reaction of the giants is going to be. Because the giants hate Big Mom. They hate her to the point where they don't even speak her name. That's how angry they are. And they hate her because she destroyed a village in Elbaf. She's also responsible for the death of one of their elders. And then she also ended up eating the kids of the orphanage, as well as Mother Caramel. And so a giant saw this happening. He saw the fact that Big Mom was eating Mother Caramel and the children alive, and he told the other giants. Now, even though we as the reader know that Mother Caramel was an evil, evil person, because in one of the darkest plot twists in One Piece, she ended up being responsible for child trafficking, the giants don't know that yet. And actually, neither does Big Mom. So for the giants, Mother Caramel was this holy woman who was running an orphanage. And so when the giant saw Big Mom eating this quote-unquote holy woman, it was an absolute travesty for them. And so that's the story of how Charlotte Linlin became known as the enemy of all giants. And so if that's the case, then what does that make Kid, right? Kid, who played a massively important role in taking her down. Would that perhaps make Kid a hero amongst all giants? And would that be enough for the giants to say, actually, you know what, Shanks? We can't help you in attacking this kid because he took down Big Mom. That doesn't mean that the giants are going to turn against Shanks. It just means that, they won't do anything against Kid, so they won't get involved, which, goes back to what Shanks says. I need your help so that this place doesn't turn into a battlefield. And so if he doesn't have the help of the giants, then Shanks, because of how Shanks is about my friends matter first and foremost, and my friend's safety is the most important thing. I think because of what we know of his character, he'll be like, all right, you know what? I'm gonna let this one go. I'm gonna give you a pass just this once. Because if Kid takes the fight to Elbaf, then this whole thing can turn into a reverie situation where we had two admirals against the revolutionaries led by Sabo, But the admirals could not use their power to their full potential because they were worried about destroying the Holy Land. So, of course, we know what happened back there, where the revolutionaries were successful in taking Kuma away, even though now Kuma wants to get back there. Plus, there's also that plot point of Kid wanting to meet Saul, who might be hiding in Elbaf. And then, of course, we know that Oda said that out of all the supernovas, he always knew that Kid was going to be important. So he's going to be important in the endgame, possibly because of his magnetic powers. And if he gets wrecked again here, I think that would throw a wrench at the pacing of the story. I also think that fights ultimately need to serve a purpose in terms of moving the story forward. So for example, in Egghead, there being a fight there makes sense. Why? Because you're fighting to escape and you're fighting to protect Vegapunk. With Law and Teach, that fight makes sense because Law is literally fighting for survival. And not just his own survival, but the survival of his crew as well, because Teach just wouldn't let it go. And then we also have the Garp situation going to rescue Kobe. So that makes sense. Like those scenarios, like it makes sense why there needs to be a fight. This one feels a little bit different. This one feels like ultimately both parties can come to some kind of an agreement where both of them get something that they want. Maybe Kid gets permission to dock in Elbaf to meet Saul, and in exchange, Shanks gets the copies of Kid's road poneglyphs. There could be a small clash where both Kid and Shanks flex on each other. I mean, just the mere admission that Shanks says, I have to actually go out there, you know. It's not like last time where, you know, Kid didn't get to meet Shanks. Like, this is different. Shanks is admitting that Kid has grown. So there might be a flex. I'm personally really looking forward to an Advanced Conquerors hockey clash at some point with Kid. So maybe they do the no touching thing. And I've actually talked about how there's an episode hinting at Ben also having Conquerors hockey as well. So Kid might actually get a hockey boost or a hockey bloom out of this confrontation. But ultimately, because of the plot points that I mentioned with Big Mom and the Giants, but then also based off of what I know of Shanks' personality, it's likely that this fight will die down or will die out before it turns into anything major. Because I do think the ultimate major fight is reserved for the Red Hair Pirates versus the Blackbeard Pirates. By the way, in that panel where they're marching out, I noticed that Building Snake appears to have two swords. Kind of makes him look like a Nitoryu user. And on that same note, the Red Hair Pirates appear to have a lot of weapons that are made out of metal. So it'd be interesting to see if Kid could actually force Shanks to fight without a sword. Regardless of what actually ends up happening in the fight, or lack thereof, I do think this is a great chapter of One Piece. Just seeing Elbaf actually in the story brought me back to one of the recent chapters of when Vegapunk was finally revealed, where we actually got to see Vegapunk's design, because it just puts things into perspective, like the fact that we're seeing these things that were promised years ago. So there's a part of me that's still kind of in disbelief about the reality that this is where we are right now in the story. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you have a great week. Take care. Catch you guys later. Bye.